Hello and welcome to this presentation of API Access Credentials from Slim CD. Here's a little information about our company. It's been presented in a lot of the other videos, so I'm going to skip that. An API Access Credential is used by a developer in place of a username and password. The concept is to provide the developer a way of putting a valid credential into a distributed system such as a POS system or a website and separate it from the challenges that might be imposed by a username and password if someone changes the password. In addition, API access credentials can be restricted so that their use is limited to a certain IP or other restrictions so they can only perform transactions and only sale transactions but not refunds, or vice versa. It can also be designated just to be used for things like pulling reports. We actually have two types of credentials, public and private. The public ones are further restricted, really minimizing the functionality you can do with them, and they are a great choice to use in things like JavaScript, where the developer puts the credential into a web page where consumers or the general public can view source on the page and see that credential. So by limiting its functionality, it's not a risk to put that credential in the wild, yet it still gives the functionality needed by the JavaScript page to keep the merchant out of PCI scope. And along that line, there are some caveats to be used. We do suggest that if you have separation of responsibilities, such as one system that performs transactions and another that pulls reports, you might want to create two separate credentials, one for each. In addition, with the JavaScript in particular, if you let the JavaScript credential actually charge credit cards, people might use that credential and test stolen credit cards against your merchant account to see if those cards are still valid. Instead, by using a public credential and limiting it to create a temporary token instead of a permanent token, not actually charging the card, all they're getting back is a token that disappears within 5 minutes and doesn't get stored in a database and doesn't have any financial impact on the cardholder or anything else, so it doesn't give them any value. Yet you, as a point-of-sale developer, can use that by getting that temporary token and then charging the card later on a server-to-server with yet a different private credential. So public credentials would be used for things that would face the public. Private credentials would be used within your own system and within POS systems or websites, etc. So credentials follow our hierarchy, and if you haven't reviewed the video on the Slim City hierarchy, you might want to take a moment to do that if you have a chance. The credentials are per client, and in our hierarchy, a client might be a particular merchant that might have one or more sites underneath them. An example of a site might be two separate websites, one that sells golf clubs, one that sells golf balls or hats or shirts. In addition, you might have a storefront where maybe a restaurant is one site, yet their website that sells hot sauce is a different site. One's retail, one's e-commerce, something like that. So one merchant can have multiple sites, which may be multiple merchant accounts in that case underneath them. In addition, there's other hierarchies in our system, and again, I invite you to check out the hierarchy. But an API access credential can be selected to be available to any site underneath the client, any of the sites, or it can be specific to a given site, and I'll cover that here in a minute. They can also be public or private. There really isn't a lot of difference between public and private, other than the website, when you generate one, really restricts the amount of things you can do on a public. It's a way of encouraging you to really minimize what you do when what power you give to a credential when you make it public facing. So here's the API Access Credential screen. In this test account, there happen to be a lot of them created as developers use it, but we're going to switch over to the web, and we're actually going to take a quick look at that. So let's go to we're going to log in with a test account, and we will click on Config and API Access Credentials. So now that we're in the API Access Credentials menu item, it shows us all the ones that are created, and it tells you what they can be used for. So we will create a new one, And in creating a new one, I have a choice to tie it to a specific account. And in this case, there's only one site ID underneath here. I can tie it to a specific one, so it can only be used on this one. Or I can say it must be specified the site ID and the price ID and the key at runtime. So if I tie it to a specific one, I can default these values to 0 because it can only be used on this one. Or if I provide the site ID and price ID when performing a credit card transaction, they must match exactly. So it's your choice whether you specify it at runtime always and set it up this way, or whether you tie it to a specific account, in which case you can default these values in your direct connection API or your hosted payment page or your JavaScript. You can then leave these out and they'll default to 0 because we already know which site it's for. In a public one, we recommend, if it's JavaScript, using the queuing of the data to get a temporary token. You can also get a permanent token back with load, which does create a database record. You can also auth only to verify the card is good, but that also gives nefarious actors the ability to do the same, so I don't suggest you do that, but we do make these things available. We also include get signature image in case you've put it out there where you're retrieving signatures from specific sales. You may have a need to do that to display a receipt, etc. And again, I would create two separate credentials, one to do one to the other, if that's your goal. If you click on private, it gives you many more options of the type of transactions you can run, the type of things you can do. Here you can do your refunds and other things as well. You can run any of our web services, from reportings to images to transactions to receipts, etc. So there's a lot of power built in here. You can restrict them by IP address. You can give them a little description so you know why you've created it, and you can use referrer pages. I don't really like referrer pages because not all browsers include them, and they can be spoofed and all kind of things, but it is an option to give you a little bit of a warm and fuzzy. If it's consumer facing, you can't restrict by IP address, but if it's server to server, certainly you can put IP addresses in here. Let's go back to the slideshow. So we've covered a lot of this already, the public and private, and how to restrict the IP addresses. And in private ones, all the different options that you can get. All of the web service are here. All the transaction types can individually be specified. And if you're using them in hosted payment pages, all the hosted payment pages functionality can be specified for the things that you're doing server to server. So when you've created one, you always can come in and modify it. And we'll go back to our website. If I list them all again, I can click on an individual one and I can turn on or off different features, and by doing so, when I save this, it'll actually change. I'm not going to save this one because someone's using it for something. It will change the list of available features that credential is allowed to do. So for a lot of testing, we'll use this one because it has everything turned on and it does not specify the site ID. In other cases, there's other tests here where they are specifying the client ID and site ID, just different uses for different things as different developers have tried to implement different features. Here's one where someone is restricted to an IP address, for example. So there's a lot of functionality available, and you can use all that in our test system to really get familiar with how it works and what you want to do. We also keep in that list the date of last use, so you can tell which ones you're actually actively using before you turn them off. You can shut one off at any time. When you use an API access credential, typically all of our web service APIs require a username and password. So in this case, you set the username to the API access credential and you leave the password out or set it to an empty string. That tells our system, don't look at this as a username and password, but look at it as an API access credential and go get the restrictions from that credential. If you can specify the client ID or set it to 0 because we know what it is based on the credential. You can also specify the site ID at all times if you want to. If the credential has a site ID in it, it must match. If the credential does not have a site ID specified in it, then you must supply a site ID or price ID when you're performing transactions or if you're doing reports. So if it's specified within the credential, you can leave that 0. If it's not specified, you must provide it. Here's a JavaScript example that's using one. You can see here's the API access credential as the username. It didn't even bother to put in a password because JavaScript's going to default it to blank, or our JavaScript functionality will default it to blank in our library. All of our libraries have good defaults, and you notice we did not bother to specify the client ID, site ID, or price ID because they're all stored inside this credential. If this credential did not have the site ID, you'd have to add the site ID in here as well. Some other considerations. API access credential will appear in our report under the clerk name field so that you get some kind of a tracking. However, if you're putting this into a point of sale system where clerks are important, you can also specify the clerk name. If we go back to the other slide, I could have added a field called clerk name, and that would have overridden the credential in our reports and associated that transaction with a specific clerk. So web-based systems might want to take advantage of that by setting the clerk name to shopping cart, or we have a merchant that's integrated with Salesforce and they set it to Salesforce so they can easily identify all transactions that came from Salesforce as opposed to individual users. The device ID field that's available in our system can be used for the same thing, but device IDs typically track a particular piece of hardware like a PC or a pin pad, and they're limited in characters, so the clerk is a better choice for that. Now, one very valuable piece of information: you cannot use an API access credential to log into a website. The website does need a credential that has a password. So while you can verify users and things like that by using the login capability of an API access credential to retrieve the user's permissions, etc., you cannot actually log into the website with one. So it does offer that protection. Again, if they're public facing, it's a better protection for you there. So there is an alternative to using API access credentials. You can create a clerk web login with a specific username and password and use that inside your distributed systems. That way, this particular clerk name will appear in the reports, as I mentioned before, whatever that login is. In that particular case, you can put that in your POS systems as a username and password, and then you're not afraid of someone changing that password because people aren't logging into the web with it. The downside of that is it's a valid username and password. You could log in the web and do anything else that a clerk can do within the Slim CD system. Hence the value in API access credentials, but that is a possibility. Now, in our hierarchy of reports, we do have chains of locations, and chains are on top of clients, and even master locations that are on top of chains. So if you want to pull reports at those levels across multiple clients, then I do suggest you use the clerk web logins for the reporting services. But again, they can log in the website. So just be aware of that when you're creating those things. And I do encourage you to take a look at our clerk login video as well to give you some information about our hierarchies and clerk logins. And I think you'll find all that in the hierarchy video. Our developer's website has all the resources for how to use them with all the APIs. Any place there's an API, if we come back and look at our developer's website, on the reference, let's just pick close batch, for instance. Close batch does want a username and password. So by putting an API access credential here, leaving the password blank, and if the credential configures the site ID, you can leave that 0. Otherwise, you can supply it. If you supply it and the credential has one, it must match. If the credential does not specify a site ID, you must provide one. So you can do that. Don't use the batch number, by the way. If you're closing a batch, let us take the current batch. That's really for our internal use. So that's a side comment. So all of the APIs that take usernames and passwords can use the API access credentials, assuming that the API access credential has been given permissions to do that particular activity. So in this particular case, here is your closed batch. You'd have to turn that on for the closed batch functionality to actually succeed. You can do just closed batch, or you can also let it do sales, voice, whatever you'd like to do there. So I've covered all of our entry points. The library samples will default the client ID and site ID to 0 for you, so you don't even have to provide them. However, if you're doing your own XML or JSON, you may or may not want to provide those depending on your experiences and how the defaults work, depending on the libraries you're using, jQuery versus others. Downloading of all of our samples is available, as I've mentioned, a lot of videos, and here's the developer resources. So that's a quick overview of API access credentials, how to create one, why you use them, where you use them, etc. For those using hosted JavaScript to create temporary tokens, I suggest you make a public one that can only create temporary tokens, and then a private one you would use in your backend, ASP.NET or PHP, whatever your web service is, Java, and the private one would have the permissions to actually charge the transaction and consume that public temporary token. Thank you very much for watching, and let us know if we can be of further help.